I was with Mark, this really important guy, longer than any other woman. Everyone thought it was because I was some kind of genius schemer, but that wasn't it. I just knew my place. Then, one day, he brought his old girlfriend, Sarah, back from overseas, and I just vanished. I was pregnant, and I quietly walked away from his whole world. 3 years later, my little girl Lily and I were getting ice cream. We were laughing and being silly when suddenly Mark showed up. He pointed at Lily and asked, "Emily, who is that?" "She's my sister," I said, my voice shaking. "Cute, right?" I was totally panicking, trying to think of what to say. Lily, being a smart kid, figured it out right away. She ran over to him and hugged his leg. "Sir," she said super sweetly, "my sister is single, she's not married, and she's totally free to date you." Later that night, it was hot, and Mark had me pinned against his car. He was kissing me like crazy. "Em," he whispered, his voice all rough, "say you missed me." I shook my head because I wasn't going to give in that easily. He kissed me even harder. "But I missed you," he said. "Every single day, every single night." It started one day when I was at this really boring party with a bunch of rich ladies. To be honest, it felt like they were all ganging up on me. The only reason someone who wasn't rich or fancy, was even there was because of the guy I was with, Mark. He was a huge deal, super powerful. People say, when one person rises, so do their connections, and that was totally true in my case. But I'd started from nothing, and my best skill was knowing how to act and understanding how things really were. Even though I'd been with Mark for almost 2 years, longer than any other woman, I never let it go to my head. I wasn't arrogant, and I didn't feel like I was special. So I was just sitting quietly in a corner, enjoying my little cakes. But, of course, the conversation turned to me. One of them said, "we're all curious. Mr. Thompson always seems so serious and distant. He's not like that when you're, is he?" Another asked. "Exactly," a third chimed in. "When he just looks at me, I feel like I can't breathe. Aren't you ever scared of him?" "Is Mr. Thompson strict when it's just the two of you?" "He's so hard to figure out. How did you even get him to like you?" "Just between us, one whispered. "Is he, good at that?" My fork almost slipped out of my hand because I was shaking so much. "Well," I said, "he's okay, I guess. Nothing special." "No way," one of them said. "A guy like him doesn't seem ordinary in any way." "He's always busy with work," I mumbled, trying to come up with an answer. "We don't see each other that much." Just when I felt like I was drowning in their questions, my phone buzzed. When I saw Boss on the screen, I felt so relieved. I quickly excused myself to take the call somewhere private. It was Mark. His voice was low and sounded tired. "Having tea?" "Yes," I said, "and I stopped by the mall earlier." "What did you buy?" "A purse and a necklace." "Go back and get a new dress." "But I just bought one." "A nightgown." "Mr. Thompson." My face turned red. I looked around like I'd done something wrong and quickly turned off the speakerphone. "I'll pick you up in an hour." Mark was always straight to the point. And with that, he hung up. I used that as an excuse to leave early. I stopped at the mall on the way out to buy a dress. A nightgown, actually. A really sexy one. Black, silky, and soft. It was low cut, with high slits on the sides, and had some lace. Just the kind Mark liked. The second I got into his car, Mark motioned for me to come closer. I sat on his lap like he wanted. I'd just had a spa treatment, so my skin was smooth and smelled nice, and I leaned into him. Mark seemed happy. He took off his glasses, put them in the console, and his fingers wrapped around my waist. "Gained a little weight," he said, gently squeezing. His tone was actually approving. "I've been eating a bit more lately. I'll start eating healthy tomorrow," I said, my cheeks turning pink. Even after almost 2 years with him, I still got shy when we were close like this. "You don't need to diet," Mark said, holding me tighter. "You're fine the way you are." I rested my head on his chest, obediently. "Mr. Thompson," I said, "you just got back from a business trip. You must be tired coming to pick me up." "Then shouldn't you give me a special reward tonight?" I lifted my head a little flustered. Shouldn't you be resting instead? Mark chuckled softly, hooking a finger under my strap and slowly pulling it down. Emily, he said, you've gotten braver. I'm just worried about your health, Mr. Thompson, I mumbled. Mark looked me up and down, his fingers brushing the design on my nightgown. Fair enough, he said. After all, something ordinary could never be enough for someone as special as Miss Johnson. My eyes widened in shock. My arms wrapped around his waist suddenly felt cold. Mark? I couldn't even remember how many times I'd begged him, my fingers unable to hold onto him. They fell weakly to the side of the bed. Mark leaned down, kissing my lips again. Mr. Thompson. I barely managed to open my eyes, looking at him through a blur of tears. Em, he murmured, letting go of me only to playfully nibble my ear up. Relax. No matter how busy or tired your man is, I'll always have energy for this. Inside, I was cursing him. Mean, arrogant, distant, and untouchable on the outside, calm and collected. But behind closed doors, a total jerk. Who would have guessed that Mr. Thompson, who buttoned his shirts all the way up in public and rarely smiled, had one strange preference. He loved having me unbutton his shirt for him. By the time I woke up the next day, Mark was already gone. As his pampered canary, my daily routine was basically spending money and finding ways to pass the time. So I decided to just laze around until noon. While I was scrolling through Facebook, I saw a trending post. Rising star artist Sarah Miller to return to the country for a nationwide art tour. First stop, Capital City. For some reason, the name Sarah felt strangely familiar. I couldn't shake the feeling I'd heard it somewhere before. I typed her name into the search bar, and, to my shock, the third suggested search was Sarah Miller Mark Thompson. My fingers stiffened as I clicked on it. The result was a single Facebook post. This is what I think of when I imagine a real power couple. A top businessman and his unforgettable first love. The post had a blurry photo, but even with the bad quality, it was clear. A tall, handsome man and a petite, beautiful woman. She was smiling gently at the camera, while he was looking at her with tenderness. She was wearing his coat. I closed my phone and lay back on the bed, closing my eyes. Memories came flooding back faster and faster, until one image finally stopped in my mind. I was lying in a hospital bed, pale and weak, my stomach swollen with pregnancy. Mark stood in front of me, his arm around Sarah's waist. Both wore wedding rings. His voice was cold and sharp. Emily, have the baby and I'll give you 10 million. Sarah can't have children because of her health, so this baby will be hers. Take the money and never come back. You should know that having Sarah as a mother is the best thing for the child. So it turns out I'm just a sad side character in a story. After taking the money and leaving, I became bitter, sneaking back into the country to try and get my child back. But the child only loved Sarah, refusing to see me as his real mother. He saw me as a disgrace. Overwhelmed by despair, I went crazy, eventually planning to hire someone to kill Sarah. In the end, it was Mark who sent me to a mental hospital. I died there a few years later. That was my fate in the original story. And now, Sarah is coming back. The wheels of fate are starting to turn. If nothing unexpected happens, last night will lead to me getting pregnant. The final 2 rounds last night were the only times in almost 2 years that Mark didn't use protection. Truthfully, this was all part of Mark's plan, wasn't it, for Sarah, to give her a child. Whenever Mark was in the capital, no matter how late, he would always come home. But this time was different. 2 days had passed and I hadn't seen him at all. The messages I sent him seemed to disappear. When I called, he did answer, brief and to the point as always. The company's been busy these past few days. If you're bored at home, go shopping or have tea. Be good, and remember, no dieting. When will you be back? I'll be home in a couple of days. The call ended, and shortly after, my bank account balance went up by $5 million. Mark sent a text, buy whatever you want. In the past, whenever Mark sent me money, I'd send him lots of kissy emojis or write sweet things to play the role of the perfect girlfriend. I'd make sure to keep the big boss happy. But this time, I stared at the chat box for a long while before typing just 2 words. Thank you. Mark didn't reply, as usual. On the 3rd evening, I saw the news on TV. The usually private and low profile Mark had made a rare public appearance at the airport to pick someone up. That someone was his legendary first love, Sarah. The news footage showed Mark and Sarah surrounded by bodyguards. I couldn't get a clear view of Sarah's face. Mark had shielded her from the cameras so well. Unlike me, my photos and videos, candid or otherwise, regularly appeared in gossip magazines, a treasured first love and a mere plaything. Of course, the treatment wasn't the same. I turned off the TV and went downstairs. Dinner was already prepared. No need to wait for Mr. Thompson. He won't be home tonight, I told the staff. I sat at the dining table and began eating. I ate carefully, enjoying every bite. After all, this would likely be my last meal in Mark's house. Mark said he'd be back in 2 days. He was a man of his word, so I chose to leave on the night Sarah returned to the capital, when he was likely too busy with her to think about me. I didn't take any clothes or jewelry. The credit cards Mark had given me were left where they were, but I had another bank card in my name with almost 8 figures in the account. The money came from selling the first property Mark ever gave me. My mother passed away a long time ago, and my father remarried and started a new family over a decade ago, cutting ties with me. Leaving the capital, I had no idea where to go, so I randomly bought a plane ticket. Just before boarding, my phone rang. In the past 2 years, I had never missed a call from Mark, but this time, I let it ring until it stopped. He wasn't the type to call twice. I turned off my phone, removed the SIM card, and snapped it in two. As I carried my suitcase up the boarding stairs, I couldn't resist looking back. The capital's night was starless, covered in heavy smog. Truthfully, I didn't even like the capital. I just liked someone who lived there. Meanwhile, Mark lit a cigarette and dialed a familiar number once more. To his surprise, the cold voice of an automated operator answered. "The number you are trying to reach is currently unavailable. Please try again later. Sorry." Frowning, Mark pressed redial. The result was the same. He put out the cigarette, turned, and walked back into the private lounge, grabbing his coat on the way out. Sarah stood up to stop him, but he avoided her hand. "Stay and enjoy yourselves. I'll host another time." "Mark?" Sarah's voice trembled as her eyes filled with tears. Mark didn't look back, leaving with long strides. As soon as he got into the car, before the door even closed, he gave the driver a cold order. "Drive faster. Head to the one residence house." The car sped through the city. Just as they approached the house, a sudden downpour began. The driver gripped the steering wheel tightly, his focus unwavering as he dared not slow down. Fortunately, the journey was uneventful and the car eventually pulled up in front of the main building. A servant was already waiting outside with a large black umbrella. Mark stepped out, bending slightly to avoid the rain. "Where is she?" he asked immediately. "Miss ate dinner and then went upstairs to rest," the servant replied. Mark's tense shoulders eased slightly, but his steps didn't falter as he walked into the main building. The house was dark and eerily quiet. Something felt off. For the past 2 years, Emily had never missed one of his calls. And no matter how late he came home, she would always leave a light on in the living room. There was always a nightlight glowing in the upstairs hallway, too. The servant knelt to help him change shoes, but Mark stopped them with a raised hand. "I'll check on her myself," he said. The house was kept at a constant temperature, but Mark didn't bother to remove his coat as he went upstairs. The master bedroom door was slightly ajar, and the room inside was pitch black. Mark stood at the doorway, his long fingers gripping the door handle. For a moment, he hesitated, reluctant to push it open. The rain grew heavier, pulling his thoughts back to the present. He opened the door. "Em?" There was no response. The bed was neatly made, the two pillows still side by side. But the bed was empty. Mark stood in the doorway for a while before stepping inside. He turned on the lights, illuminating the room. Everything looked as it always had, familiar and unchanged. Her makeup table still held the usual bottles and jars, casually arranged. But on the tabletop lay a few bank cards and a note. Mark's chest tightened as he picked up the note and unfolded it. The message was brief. "Mr. Thompson, thank you for your care these past 2 years. I wish you peace, success, and happiness in the years to come. Sincerely, Emily." Mark set the note down slowly. The mirror reflected his face, stern, cold, and unreadable. But only he knew. The storm brewing within him, his emotions, usually so controlled, felt on the verge of bursting. If Emily were standing in front of him right now, he wouldn't be able to hold back. He'd discipline her until she submitted completely. Mark turned and left the room. Downstairs, his secretary, assistants, and servants waited quietly. Without lifting his gaze, he ordered coldly, "Replace all the house staff immediately." "Mr. Thompson, the one residence doesn't keep useless people," he said flatly, casting a frosty glance at the startled group. He removed his watch slowly, flexing his wrist. His voice dropped even further, becoming almost threatening. "If she returns unharmed, you'll be lucky. If she's hurt, even a single strand of hair, you all know the consequences." With that, Mark strode out. The rain roared outside, and the others barely caught his parting words. "Contact the Aviation Bureau. Find out exactly where she is." During flights, I often sleep so deeply that I lose all sense of time. I remember the first time I traveled with Mark for a business trip. I had fallen into such a deep sleep that when I woke up, I found myself completely sprawled on top of him. To my horror, there was even a suspicious wet spot on his shoulder. I was mortified, terrified even, already bracing myself for the possibility that this man, this untouchable force of nature, might toss me off the plane or feed me to the fish after landing. But Mark didn't do any of that. He didn't even scold me. Instead, he simply continued working, glasses perched on his nose as he went through his papers with calm efficiency. When he finally noticed my embarrassment, his voice was unusually soft, almost gentle. "Had a good sleep?" "Yes, Mr. Thompson," I stammered. "Would you like something to eat?" I nodded, then shook my head, unsure of how to respond. Still, Mark ordered food for me. "Eat something first. I'll wrap this up shortly," he said. After that, I went with him on many trips, whether for business or vacation. Almost every time, I'd end up curled up in his arms, sleeping soundly. Mark was a man who valued privacy. He rarely used his private jet. But on those occasions when he did, my ears would burn at the memory. The limited space and Mark's playful nature often led to situations where I could barely hold back. My voice must not have been as quiet as I thought, judging by the way the flight attendants avoided meeting my eyes when we got off the plane. Now, traveling alone for the first time, I couldn't seem to sleep. Maybe I'd grown too used to the safety of being in his arms. The cabin broadcast announced the flight conditions. It had started raining not long after takeoff, with lightning and thunder getting worse as the storm grew heavier. Many flights were delayed or forced to turn back. When the announcement came that my flight was also returning due to the weather, passengers began grumbling in frustration. "This is rare. I've never heard of a flight turning back because of rain," someone muttered. "Right," another chimed in. "They always say flights never get delayed unless it is an extreme situation." An absurd thought crept into my mind, one I immediately dismissed as ridiculous. Mark, with his powerful connections, inherited from both his and his mother's families, had power that was beyond my understanding. Even the faintest glimpse of his influence felt like a gap I could never cross. But no matter how unbelievable his reach, the idea of him arranging a flight's return for a woman seemed laughable. A man as calm and controlled as Mark wouldn't do something so absurd, not even for me. Planes turn back for all sorts of reasons, weather, technical issues, emergencies, but never for a woman. At the airport, passengers were put up in nearby hotels. I got my luggage and joined the crowd moving toward the exit. But when I reached the terminal hall, I stopped. I stood there, waiting, until the first light of dawn broke through the windows. Mark never appeared. I laughed at my own foolishness. As expected, I was just a minor character in this story. Even if some side plots changed slightly, nothing important ever changed. The main male character would always end up with the main female character. The disposable supporting character would remain just that. I picked up my luggage and boarded another plane. The morning air in the capital, after the rain, was unusually fresh. I told myself that just as Mark had wished in the beginning, I would never return to the capital again. The following summer, in a quiet southern town, I gave birth to my daughter, Lily. Not the boy described in the book. Perhaps the moment I left the capital, some things had already begun to change in ways I couldn't have predicted. A tiny ripple, insignificant on its own, had somehow disrupted the flow. But I wasn't disappointed. On the contrary, I felt a deep sense of joy in a daughter. Even if Mark were to find out one day, he wouldn't try to take her from me. All I wanted was to cherish and protect this little one, giving her everything I had missed in my own life. Miss Johnson, come look, the nanny said, bringing the pink bundle to my bedside. Lily smiling. I glanced down at Lily, fast asleep but smiling in her dreams. She's such a beauty, Miss Johnson. Not even a month old, and you can already tell she's going to be stunning. They say daughters take after their fathers. Mark was undeniably handsome, so it made sense that his daughter would be beautiful. I gently held Lily's tiny hand. A bittersweet warmth filled my chest, but it was quickly overtaken by an overwhelming sense of happiness. When Lily was 6 months old, I saw Mark on TV for the first time. It struck me as odd. No matter how private and low profile Mark was, during the 2 years I spent with him, he'd had to attend a few unavoidable public events. Though his exposure was minimal, it wasn't as though he'd completely vanished. Yet in the year since I left the capital, it was as if Mark's name had been wiped off the face of the earth. So when I suddenly heard his name and saw his face on TV after all this time, I was stunned. He had lost so much weight. His already lean frame now appeared almost gaunt. His complexion, once healthy, was pale, carrying a faint sickliness. What shocked me most was how his entire demeanor had changed. If he had once been cold and composed, he now exuded a world-weary indifference. A reporter attempted to interview him. Mr. Thompson, with Miss Miller's art tour successfully concluded, can we expect an announcement about your upcoming wedding? Apologies, Mr. Thompson won't be answering any personal questions today, his assistant interjected, while bodyguards swiftly pushed the reporters back. Mark didn't say a word. He suddenly stood and, in a breach of decorum, walked out mid-event. The broadcast quickly cut away, scrambling to cover the disruption, and I stood frozen in front of the TV, my heart sinking as I watched him leave. In that brief moment, I caught a glimpse of the darkness in his eyes, a void of emptiness. A heavy ache weighed on my chest, inexplicably suffocating. It wasn't until Lily woke up crying that I snapped out of it. I picked up my daughter, her tear-streaked little face pressing against mine. Her thick, dark brows resembled Mark's. Her nose, with its pronounced bridge, was distinctly Mark's as well. But Mark didn't know she existed, and perhaps he never would. That somewhere in this world, there was a little girl, a beautiful child, who was his daughter. A daughter born to Emily, just for him. When Lily was 10 months old, I weaned her. When she was a year and a half, I returned to the capital for the first time. A college roommate who had bought me breakfast for an entire semester was getting married. She wanted me to attend her wedding, and I couldn't refuse. Over the years, I had faced more malice than I could count. But there had been a few people who treated me with kindness and concern, rare as they were, and I treasured them deeply. On this trip, I privately tried to inquire about Mark. His condition had seemed off, and I was worried about his health. After the wedding, a friend called me. They say that big shot of yours is getting married soon, to the famous new artist, the one who just finished her art tour. Thank you, I replied softly. By the way, why is your friend asking about him? I'm not sure, just thank you for her. After hanging up, I found myself unable to recover for a long while, until a voice suddenly rang out behind me. Emily, it really is you. I thought that back view looked familiar. Turns out I was right. You've gained a bit of weight, though, and your chest is bigger, too. Ugh, so unfair. You're even more attractive to men now. The young woman, dressed up like a sparkling Christmas tree, stomped her foot in mock indignation. I recognized her immediately. She was one of the socialites I used to have tea with, the kind who pried into Mark's private life with relentless curiosity. But I had no desire to reconnect with anyone from my past. I nodded politely and turned to leave. Wait, it's been ages since I've seen you. Where have you been? She asked, blocking my way. Sorry, I have something urgent. Emily, I heard, she interrupted, grabbing my arm. Leaning in conspiratorially, her voice brimmed with excitement. They say Mark was in a car accident and almost died. Then you took his money and vanished into thin air. Is it true? If it is, you're something else. How dare you show your face in the capital again? It felt as though ice water had seeped into my veins. My fingers turned icy, trembling as I gripped her arm tightly, my nails digging into her flesh. She yelped in pain and shoved me away, but I didn't even notice. I stared at her blankly, asking, "Who did you say was in a car accident?" "Mark, of course. You didn't know?" she replied, covering her mouth. "Oh, right. The Thompson family issued a gag order. It was kept very hush-hush." "When did it happen? How badly was he hurt? Please, tell me," I pleaded. But she clammed up, shaking her head. "I didn't say anything, Emily. We never met tonight, and I never saw you. Got it?" She hurriedly left, leaving me rooted in place, dazed and disoriented for nearly 10 minutes. It wasn't until I unconsciously dialed that all-too-familiar number that I snapped back to reality. But Mark's number had long since been disconnected. I called for a car and headed to the one residence house. The entire ride, my thoughts were chaotic. Laura's words echoing endlessly in my mind. Mark was in a car accident and almost died. How bad must it have been for him to be described as almost dying? No wonder he was so thin, his complexion so pale. Lily was already a year and a half. I had left the capital more than 2 years ago. In all that time, he hadn't been able to recover his health. What kind of horrific accident had it been? I couldn't bear to imagine. The car's headlights cut through the darkness, jolting me back to my senses. What identity, what right did I have to face Mark again? To Laura and her friends, I was nothing but a gold digger. And to Mark. Instinctively, I turned to leave, but the car ahead of me suddenly stopped. Why are we stopping? Inside the car, Mark frowned impatiently, glancing at the driver. He had drunk a bit too much tonight, his head pounding, his mood sour. The driver hesitated, glancing at something outside, but before he could respond, Sarah interrupted. "It's nothing, just some random person. Keep driving." The driver glanced at Mark through the rearview mirror. Mark leaned back in his seat, his expression the usual blend of irritation and apathy. He made no move to contradict Sarah. The driver remained silent, and the car resumed its slow crawl forward. I stood by the roadside watching the car pass. It moved sluggishly, the rear window lowering a fraction. In the dim light, I caught a glimpse of Sarah's flawless, beautiful face. And beside her, a fleeting profile of Mark. Sarah's gaze skimmed over me like a feather, indifferent and disdainful. She didn't need words or gestures to utterly defeat me. This was the aura of the female lead. When Mark was injured, it must have been Sarah by his side. Naturally, he would marry her after regaining his health. The Maybach disappeared behind the house gates, its taillights fading into the distance. I turned around, walking into the night, each step heavier than the last. Inside the one residence house, Sarah reached out to help Mark, but he brushed her hand away. "Robert, arrange for a driver to take Miss Miller home." Without sparing her a glance, Mark staggered toward the main building. His assistant hurried to support him, and this time, Mark didn't push him away. Standing behind him, Sarah felt a pang of bitterness. She couldn't understand where things had gone wrong. When she returned to the capital, she had expected Mark to pursue her again, to marry her without hesitation. Even her inability to have children hadn't deterred him. Yet now, 2 years had passed, and Mark remained as distant as ever, showing her nothing beyond polite friendship. If it hadn't been for her insistence on staying by his side during his rehabilitation after the accident, his attitude toward her might have been even colder. Disheartened, Sarah climbed into the car. Meanwhile, Mark went upstairs. The house had been redecorated during his hospitalization after the accident. The master bedroom's layout and furnishings were entirely different. He dismissed his assistant and sat on the sofa for a moment before heading to the walk-in closet. Inside were numerous women's belongings and clothes, all Sarah's. Before the accident, they had already been living together. She was his girlfriend, his first love. At least, that's what everyone had told him when he woke up. Sarah herself had said as much. They were a perfect match, destined to marry. She would one day be his wife. But for reasons he couldn't explain, while Sarah was beautiful and accomplished, he didn't dislike her, yet he didn't like her either. The alcohol made him feel warm and restless. He yanked off his tie, tossing it onto the vanity. The gesture accidentally knocked over a small box. Inside were 2 thumb-sized wooden figurines, a boy holding a girl's hand. Mark picked them up absent-mindedly, about to set them down again, when something caught his eye. Turning the figures over, he saw tiny words carved into the base. M loves Mark. Mark stood there for nearly 10 minutes, holding the wooden figurines. Suddenly, he turned and left the bedroom, striding quickly downstairs. Robert, get the car ready. For some reason, a fleeting image of a lone figure under the streetlight at the house's gates flashed through his mind. The car sped off, exiting the private road and stopping at the intersection with the main street. The night was deep, birds had long returned to their nests, and the road was silent save for the occasional passing car. There was no one else in sight. Mark clenched the figurines in his hand and glanced at Robert, the seasoned driver who had worked for the Thompson family since Mark was a child. Robert, do you know who M is? Robert visibly stiffened, but quickly forced a smile to deflect. Young master, I've never heard of that name. Back then, the incident caused such a stir. Mark had been in critical condition for 3 days, barely clinging to life. The family elders were furious, and Emily's name became taboo in the Thompson household. Who would dare bring it up? Mark let out a low chuckle. I know you're all hiding something from me. Young master, Robert hesitated. But it's fine. I'll figure it out myself. Robert paled. Young master, you know how much your parents wept and struggled for your recovery after the accident. Mark raised his cold, sharp eyes, his aura seemingly even frostier since his recovery. Robert was terrified. Young master, so what does all of this have to do with this M? Nothing. There's no such person, Robert stammered. Mark's gaze dropped back to the figurines in his hand. His smile was faint but unsettling. How do you know she's a woman? Miss Johnson, it's clearly a girl's name. Robert froze mid-sentence, realizing his slip. Oh, Miss Johnson, Mark said quietly, his tone sharp. Robert's face went blank with panic. Young master. What's her full name? Emily, the woman I lived with at the one residence. She was Emily, not Sarah, wasn't she? Yes. My car accident, was it because of her? That night, Miss Johnson left abruptly. You traced her flight and were on your way to find her when the storm caused your accident. Why did she leave? Robert was drenched in cold sweat, trembling. Young master, just say it. Don't worry. If my parents hold you accountable, I'll handle it. It might have been because of Miss Miller. What did she do? When Miss Miller returned to the country, you were very close to her, Robert explained cautiously, glancing at Mark's reaction. Miss Johnson may have misunderstood and gotten jealous. Mark couldn't recall the details, but he was certain of one thing. He felt no romantic affection for Sarah. As for being close to her, Mark frowned. It didn't sound like something he would do. Robert added the final blow. You hosted a welcome party for her and helped organize her art exhibition. For several days, you didn't come home, leaving Miss Johnson alone. For the first time, Mark's composure cracked. I don't even like her. Why would I do such a thing? Robert gave him a kindly, knowing smile. Young master, you and Miss Miller grew up together, childhood sweethearts. You once said you'd marry her when you grew up. But as you got older, you stopped liking her, for reasons no one knew. Miss Miller was devastated and even attempted to take her own life. You felt guilty and promised your families you'd help her and the Miller family as compensation. So the exhibition was because of that promise? Mark asked. Robert hesitated before nodding. As far as I know, yes. Mark's final question cut through the air like a knife. So between Sarah and me, nothing happened, correct? To my knowledge, nothing at all, Robert confirmed. Mark exhaled deeply as though a weight had been lifted. I took Lily to the amusement park. At just over 2 years old, she was already a clever, mischievous little thing. She started walking and talking earlier than most kids her age. Now Lily could string together clear, full sentences with ease. While she played in the ball pit, I sat outside, waiting. Suddenly, the mall's TV switched to a breaking news segment. Mark appeared on the screen, dressed in a tailored black business suit, gold-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. He looked so dazzling it could make anyone lightheaded, yet cold enough to freeze them solid. I don't have a girlfriend. I'm single, unmarried, he said. He cast a frosty glance at the reporter. And I have no engagement or fiancé. What about Miss Miller? Just a childhood friend, he replied curtly. The reporters exchanged awkward glances. The line was drawn so clearly it left no room for speculation. What was just a childhood friend? Did that mean they weren't even friends now? I felt my heart constrict painfully. I tried to stay rational to distract myself, but I couldn't stop staring at Mark on the screen. At that moment, his gaze seemed to pierce through the camera, locking onto mine. I didn't hear what the reporter asked next. Mark's lips curved faintly, his eyes tinged with a rare hint of warmth. There was an ex-girlfriend, he said, his voice calm. She dumped me. I nearly dropped my purse. Mr. Thompson, can you share why she broke up with you? A reporter pressed. Mark adjusted his glasses, his tone indifferent. No particular reason. Maybe I just wasn't good enough. Too ordinary. The reporters were baffled, but my face burned crimson. No one around knew me. No one paid attention to me. Yet I still felt as if I'd been caught stealing, hurriedly hiding my face behind my bag. I scooped Lily out of the ball pit and held her close. Lily pouted on the verge of tears. Sweetheart, I'll buy you an ice cream, I coaxed her. Her mood shifted instantly. After getting her a cone, I tried to shake off the overwhelming emotions stirred up by the news. I joked and laughed with Lily, focusing all my attention on her. It was all a dream, I told myself. Or maybe I was just overtired from caring for my daughter. But when a Rolls-Royce Cullinan suddenly pulled up nearby, drawing every gaze in the vicinity, an alarm went off in my mind. I froze, unable to stop myself from turning around. Lily, still licking her ice cream, looked over curiously as well. When Mark stepped out of the car, I heard gasps from the people around us. My vision blurred with spots of light, and I felt dizzy, as if I'd been thrown back to the moment I first met him. He walked straight toward us. Emily, who is she? His gaze locked onto mine as he pointed at Lily. She's my sister. Cute, isn't she? My hands trembled as I stumbled over my words. Lily, catching on immediately, dashed forward and wrapped her arms around Mark's leg. Her ice cream smeared across his trousers, leaving a sticky stain, and I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by despair. Sir, isn't my sister beautiful? She's single, unmarried, and totally available. Lily's sweet, innocent voice carried a charm that could melt the hardest of hearts. But I wasn't sure if it would move Mark. Your sister? He asked. Yes, she's my sister. Mark let out a soft chuckle, bending down to lift Lily into his arms. I was so nervous I dug my nails into my palms. Mr. Thompson, I stammered. Mark ignored me, focusing on Lily. What's your name? Lily Johnson, she answered proudly. Mark frowned and finally looked at me, his expression questioning, as if asking, what kind of ridiculous name did you give our daughter? How old are you? 2 and a little bit, she replied. How much is a little bit? Lily looked to me for help. Mommy, how much is a little bit? I quickly raised my bag, using it to cover my face like a shield. As clever and charming as Lily was, she was no match for Mark, the old fox. Mark held her in his arms and turned toward the car. Emily, come here. Resigned, I followed him and got into the car. Mark took out a wet wipe and began meticulously cleaning Lily's sticky little hands. Lily was completely captivated by him. Mister, are you married? She asked, tilting her head. No, he replied. Do you have a girlfriend? Also, no. Lily immediately wrapped her chubby arms around his neck, looking up at him earnestly. Look at my mommy, mister. Mark glanced at me, his tone casual. I've seen her. Isn't she beautiful? She's all right, he said nonchalantly. I couldn't help but shoot him a glance, silently rolling my eyes. Liar. Lily, however, pouted theatrically. I didn't even know she was this dramatic. Then you must not think I'm pretty either, she sniffled. Mark pinched her chubby cheek. How could I not? You're very pretty. But I look just like Mommy, she declared. That's true, he admitted. Lily's expression turned pitiful as she continued. I've never had a daddy since I was born. Sniff, sniff. Can you be my daddy, mister? You were so gentle when you cleaned my hands. Mark sighed, taking a tissue to wipe her tears. It's not that I don't want to. It's just that your mom doesn't want me. Lily's eyes widened in shock, and so did mine. Mark, I started. He looked at me, his tone even. After all, I'm just ordinary. Clearly, this was a grudge he wasn't letting go of anytime soon. After putting Lily to sleep, I decided it was time to have an honest conversation with Mark. There was no way I would give up custody of my daughter, and letting Sarah raise her? Absolutely out of the question. If anyone tried to tear us apart, I would sooner jump into the river outside the villa with Lily in my arms. Fueled by a mix of determination and righteous fury, I stormed into the living room, ready for battle. Mark, we need to talk. Mark was lounging on the small sofa in my modest living room, his long legs looking uncomfortably cramped. Perfect. I've been meaning to talk to you too, he said, taking off his glasses and placing them on the coffee table. His gaze locked onto mine. Emily, you first, I said, trying to sound composed as I sat down across from him in one of Lily's tiny chairs. Let's talk about why you dumped me, he said, his tone as calm as if he were discussing the weather. I froze, unable to get a single word out. How could I explain this to him? Should I tell him we were characters in a book? Even I wouldn't believe that. If you can't give me a reasonable explanation, Emily, he said, his voice low, his gaze unwavering, you know there will be consequences. I swallowed nervously, my mind racing. After much hesitation, I decided to tell the truth, no matter how ridiculous or pitiful it sounded. By the time I finished, tears were streaming down my face. Mark, they say a couple shares a bond after spending even a single night together. We've been together for so long, and I even gave you a child. But you sent me to a mental institution and let me die there. Mark pinched the bridge of his nose, sighing. So all this is because of a dream? It wasn't a dream, it was real. It's the plot of a book, and it actually happened. And in this book, I married Sarah? Yes. And the son I supposedly had? Yes. And the 1 billion yuan I gave you? That's because I knew the plot ahead of time and left. That's why things changed, I said, wiping my red, puffy eyes. But I don't care about all that. If you try to take Lily from me, you'll have to kill me first. What kind of nonsense are you thinking? Mark stood, walked over, and lifted me from the tiny chair like a child. Emily. But that's how the story goes. The details might change, but the ending never does, right? I mumbled, feeling more and more wronged. The male lead always ends up with the female lead. Otherwise, how could he even be the male lead? Mark cupped my face, gently wiping the tears from the corners of my eyes. Then why couldn't it be that I fell for you? That from the moment I did, the entire plot of the book changed? His voice softened, his gaze steady and warm. The male lead might be with the female lead, but in a love story, the woman the male lead loves is the true female lead. Emily, can't you feel it after 2 years together? The one I love is you. I couldn't bring myself to believe it. That Mark could love someone like me. The gulf between us was as vast as the sky and the earth. Mark seemed to sense my hesitation, but he only said one thing. Emily, if we truly are characters in a book, then what's so unreasonable about the two of us being together? I was still doubtful. Mark, do you think the author is crazy? He smirked. You're overthinking. They just wrote it this way because readers like it. But how could readers enjoy a story about a side character overshadowing the first love? As if reading my mind, Mark said, Sarah isn't my first love. Before you, I never had anyone. I opened my mouth to respond, but Mark spoke first. And you, Miss Johnson, must have plenty of experience, right? I glared at him. Don't pretend. You've already investigated me, haven't you? Mark's lips curved into a teasing smirk. Then why would someone with your experience think I'm ordinary in bed? Mark, I exclaimed, stomping my foot and reaching to cover his mouth. Could he please stop bringing up that word? I was going to develop PTSD from it. The night I took Mark to his hotel, as he was about to get into the car, he suddenly pinned me against the vehicle. There's an empty room, I protested, but no bed, no fresh linens, he replied, leaning closer, his breath warm against my skin. Mark tilted his head to kiss me. There are so many people here, and someone might see, I whispered, my face burning. Say you missed me, Em. Tell me you think about me every day. Mark didn't care, his kiss growing deeper and more insistent. I shook my head, refusing to say it. I couldn't admit it, not just every day. I thought about him every second, every minute. But I didn't want him to know. He had told me Sarah wasn't his first love, but he still hadn't explained their supposed engagement or why she had been with him that night. I think about you, Em, he murmured, his voice a mix of longing and tenderness. Every day, every night. The sound of distant laughter and children playing drifted on the night breeze. I struggled weakly, lifting my foot to lightly kick his shin, trying to remind him we weren't alone. Under the dark sky, his gaze was filled with both desire and gentleness. My heart burned, my limbs turned to jelly. Between breaths, I murmured his name. Mark. I've been back to the capital, I admitted softly. I know, he said. You know? Mark raised a hand to wipe the tears from the corner of my lips. I didn't realize it was you at the time. I stared at him confused. After the car accident, I forgot some things, he said, as though it was no big deal. But I couldn't hold back my tears. I had noticed the scar on his brow earlier that day. Even after all this time, it was still faintly visible. I couldn't imagine how horrific it must have been. The day you returned, I started to remember, he continued. I should have come to find you and Lily sooner, but there were too many things in the capital I needed to settle first to ensure you both could come back without worry. Mark leaned down, kissing my tears gently. Come back to the capital with me, Em. Let's get married. Preparing to return to the capital turned out to be more time-consuming than I had anticipated, delaying us by another 2 or 3 days. But Mark, impatient as ever, didn't wait. He bought a bed and all the necessary items, then promptly moved out of his hotel and into the small apartment Lily and I shared. Who would have thought, though, that trouble would arrive unexpectedly in the form of my father? Lily was beyond excited and refused to sleep, even as the clock struck 11. Mark and Lily stared each other down, but in the end, Mark was the one who conceded defeat. Feeling sorry for him, I scooped Lily into my arms. Time to go to bed, sweetheart. I want to sleep with Daddy, she declared. I pinched her little cheeks and whispered in her ear, Don't you want a baby brother or sister? Mommy and Daddy have to sleep together to make that happen. Lily immediately hugged my neck tightly. Okay, Mommy, I'll go to bed. As we reached the doorway, she turned back to look at Mark. My heart sank, sensing trouble. I moved to cover her mouth, but it was too late. Lily gave him a little thumbs up and shouted, Good luck, Daddy! Lily wants a baby brother tomorrow. I stared at the torn nightgown lying on the carpet. Mark, I glared at him. What is wrong with you? Why do you keep ripping my clothes? Em, you've gained weight, he said, effortlessly shifting the topic. I froze. After giving birth to Lily, I had struggled with some body image issues. I'd started working out as soon as I stopped nursing, and I was now back to my pre-pregnancy weight. But hearing Mark say I'd gained weight, I'll start dieting tomorrow, I blurted out instinctively. You will not, Mark said firmly, pulling me into his arms. His gaze dropped to my chest. You're perfect like this. But you just said I gained weight. You were too thin before. If I don't stay thin, I won't fit into half my clothes. Basic professionalism, Mark. He kissed my forehead softly. I won't let you go through that again. Mark, those 2 years we were together, I wasn't unhappy, really. You treated me so well, better than I ever deserved. I rested my head on his chest, my voice quiet. At first, I was just scared of being poor and desperate to improve my life. But in the end, I took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of his embrace. I realized I couldn't leave you. Em, he murmured, lowering his head to kiss me. I'll give you all the money you could ever need, but more importantly, I'll give you all the love in the world. And Lily. Of course, her too, Mark replied with a soft chuckle. Then he added, almost casually, Lily was breastfed, wasn't she? Yes. That explains it. What does it explain? He tightened his hold on me. The day I saw you in that white dress. It was a bit tight, and every man who passed by couldn't help but look at you. Were you jealous? I teased, trying to hide my grin. Very jealous, he admitted, kissing me deeply. Em, you're only allowed to let me look. I already only let you, I whispered. Lily wants a little brother, he said, his voice dropping. She's always wanted one, I replied. And you, do you want one? I'm a little scared, I confessed. Scared of what? Scared the plot will reset, I said, my voice trembling. Scared you'll be drawn into it and fall for someone else again. That won't happen, he said with absolute certainty. I saw the sincerity in his eyes. Mark, I want to believe you, I whispered, but promise me, if that day ever comes, don't separate a mother from her child. I couldn't survive it. Em, he said, his voice soft and steady. Trust me. 10 years into our marriage, Mark woke me up in the middle of the night. Mark, what are you doing? It's the middle of the night. I groaned, half asleep. Why did you tell people I'm ordinary in bed? I was too tired to argue and smacked the bed in frustration. What did you want me to say, that Mr. Thompson is a legend in bed? You should have been honest, Mark said, rubbing my face affectionately before flipping me onto my back. Lily and her brother aren't home tonight, Em. You can be as loud as you want. I don't want to, I protested. I want to sleep, Mark. Then close your eyes and sleep, he said, his warm hands pulling me closer. How am I supposed to sleep like this? I muttered. Be good, Em. Just once, he coaxed. Clearly not as strong as you used to be, I quipped. I regretted it immediately, but it was too late. That night, I was indeed loud enough for the entire staff to avoid eye contact with me the next day. I also woke up with a hoarse voice. Furious, I kicked Mark out of the bedroom that night. But somehow, one thing led to another, and we ended up playing out a scene in his study. This life was becoming impossible. Many years later, I saw Sarah again. By then, our hair had turned white. She brought up the past, her tone tinged with lingering resentment. Emily, after Mark's car accident, everything could have gone back to normal. I was supposed to be his leading lady. But why, even after he forgot you, didn't he love me? I didn't know how to answer, so I glanced over at Mark, who stood not far away. Even in his later years, he was tall, handsome, and still capable of making my heart race. You've found your own leading man, haven't you? I reminded her. Sarah sighed, her gaze lingering on Mark. Some things are hard to let go of. I didn't reply. She was too old to be this dramatic. Instead, I walked toward Mark, who met me halfway and took my hand. Our grandchildren were playing nearby with a pair of delicate wooden figurines. They suddenly noticed the words carved into the base. In their childish voices, they read them aloud. Em loves Mark. Mark loves Emily. Wow, it's Grandpa and Grandma.